and it negates or gives an opposite meaning to the word. This means no pistis, or no faith. Well, you got three kinds of faith. Actually, you got two kinds, but I'll classify no faith along with it. You have apistus, no faith. You have no faith. And then you have little faith. Every time Jesus would say, "Oh, ye of little faith," that was because the apostles were they were young men that had been called by Jesus, and they were kids. I keep commenting, you'll see Jesus walking in a wheat field or a cornfield with apostles, and they're old and they got long gray beards. That's not the apostles when he called them. Jesus was 30 when he called them to follow him. They could not have been over 20, 21, 22 years old. They were kids. And he would look at them and say, he told them at one time, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And being kids, they went, "Duh. Is that because we have brought no bread with us?" He said, "I'm not talking about bread. I'm talking about the doctrine." The doctrine, that's in Matthew, the 16th chapter. He said, when I'm talking about leaven, I'm talking about the sin. Leaven was a type of sin. That was the same thing that we put in rolls and we call yeast. Boy, it sure is good, just like sin. It sure tastes good. Doctrine, didache, means instruction. He said, I'm not talking about literal leaven, I'm talking about instruction. So you've got no faith. Little faith is the word O-L-I-G-O-P-I-S-T-I-S. Oligos pistis, it comes from O-L-I-G-O-S and P-I-S-T-I-S. Jesus commented to the apostles, "O ye of oligos pistis, O ye of puny faith." Puny faith means there's some faith there, but it has to lead to the third kind of faith, increasing faith. Faith has to grow. It must grow. Increasing faith. The apostles come to Jesus and they said, "Lord," this is in Luke the 17th chapter, they said, "Lord, increase our faith." That's because they had little faith, and it's going to have to grow. Faith has to grow. Well, he says and tells them how it grows. He also tells us in 2 Peter 1 and 5. 1 and 5. Besides all this, give all diligence, add to your faith. And he names 7 things. 7 things. And it takes adding the 7 things for faith to increase. This word add, that's not an invitation. That word add is the word epi, C-H-O-R-E-G-E-O. Corregeo looks very familiar to us. That's because it is. Corregeo is our word choreography. C-H-O-R-E-G, choreography. A choreographer is a dance leader. And that is not a choice. In the Greek, that is what you call an imperative mood. An imperative is a command. And that's something, when it's one of the apostles writing one of the epistles, that's the Holy Spirit that is inspiring them to write these words down. Well, the Holy Spirit is Christ in us. So that's as much of a command if Jesus is the God of the Old Testament, and he is, he said before Abraham was, I am. And boy, the Pharisees, they took up stones to stone him for saying that, for accusing him of being the, he said he was the I am God. We know that is the God of the Old Testament because when God came to Moses, he said, you go tell Pharaoh, I am has sent me. He said, what if they say, what is his name? What if Israel says that? You tell them, I am has sent me. So when Jesus told the Pharisees in John 8, I am, or I am the way, I am the door, I am the truth, I am the life. When he said that, he was saying, I am Jehovah. And so, add would be just as much of a command when he said, let there be light. Well, and there was light. So when God says add, and he said that because that was inspired by Peter to add to our faith. He said it. So add, epicorrego, epi means to cover or superimpose upon your life. Superimpose. The choreography of God. Choregeo comes from choros and ago. Ago means to lead. Choros is a circular dance, and the Jews had a circular dance. They called it the sacred dance. I've got a book on the sacred dance of the Jews. They call that the Haggadah, H-A-G-G-A-D-A-H, not to be confused with the Haggadah, one G. This has got two G's. So that's the circular dance. Haggadah is the circular dance, and that's what we are commanded to add 7 things.
I have to go to the
when you have faith
shop now.
increasing, when you have little faith,
It's
you
difficult
have a
with the new
tendency
shifter.
to believe Jesus sometime and believe self the other time.
Muzami,
When you have
thanks for the
no
like, but
faith,
I had an accident.
Apistus, and Jesus used that.
I have to service my
several
truck.
times.
1 second.
Or the apostles used that. Look over here.
7.
1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians. Or is it 2 Corinthians? The 10th chapter.
Juristic
The
23.
10th chapter. And he says here, in verse 15, he's talking about
How
to
do I go
Corinth,
to
he wrote
services?
letters, and they said, your letters are weighty.
7.
They're full of correction, and we don't like that. He said, I know you don't like it. In verse 10, well, let me read verse 9.
I need
That I may
to know how
not
to.
seem if I would terrify you by my letters. He was hard on them. For his letters, say the people at Corinth, are weighty and powerful. They're too much for us. But his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible, the way he talks to us.
Told to service.
Corinth was a weak, apostate church. They were always arguing and fighting. I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas. Oh yeah, you know what I think about you?
Okay, let's decouple this.
They were similar.
And,
I've had
let's
people
go
say,
fix our
I would
truck.
never go to a church that fights, and you wouldn't go to Corinth, and you wouldn't go to Galatia, and you wouldn't go to Ephesus, and you wouldn't go to Colossia, and you wouldn't go to Philippi. They were fighting in all of them. Then he says, his speech is contemptible. Then down here in verse 15, Paul says, I'm not boasting in myself. In verse 13, we will not boast of things without measure, things that have no measure to them. The word measure is ametros, A-M-E-T-R-O-S.
Sorry, it takes a little bit time. I'm
Metron,
learning to shift that.
R-O-N, metron means a measure. We get the word meter out of that. A meter is a British term. It's a measure of faith, and everyone has been given a measure, a meter of faith, but ametros means no measure. Well, that actually would be no faith. No faith. Now, let's keep reading here. And he says, we will not boast of things without measure, but according to the measure, the metron, the meter,
Yeah, now we're good to
of
go.
the rule, here's what we will boast in. The measure of the rule of God. Rule is the word canon. Canon comes from the word cane. A cane was something they used to measure foundation. They would treat a cane and put it on a foundation, make sure that it was level. So he said, we boast in the things of the measure which God hath distributed to us through his word, a measure to reach even unto you. Then he says in verse 15, not boasting of things without measure, ametros, that is, of other men's labors. I'm not going to boast about other men's labors. Reminds me of a verse that Paul used over here in Romans, the 15th chapter, in verse 18. Oh, let me read 18 through 20. For I will not dare to speak of any of those things which Christ hath not wrought by me, to make the Gentiles obedient by word and deed, through mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about unto Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ. Yea, so have I strived to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named. He's saying, I'm not going to stand around Jerusalem and preach where Peter's building a church, lest I should build upon another man's foundation. We have young preachers that have left here, and all they do is repeat me. That's okay, but they want to take credit for it. That's okay too. The judgment will come from God. Now that takes us back over here in verse 15. Let me read that again. Not boasting of things without measure, ametron, that is, of other men's labors. I'm not going to take credit for what other men have built. But having hope when your faith is increased. We're talking about faith growing. When your faith is increased, that we shall be enlarged by you. It means to be built up by you according to the rule, to our rule abundantly. He says, and let's go read on, to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, and not to boast in another man's line. Don't boast. It's okay for me to teach you as a seminary student. But don't go out and say, I did all of this myself, and I'll print out Jim Brown's messages and I'll take credit for it. If you're not capable of exegeting the Word of God, you don't have any business teaching. If you can't go into it yourself and see what these things mean. Of things made ready to our hand. So Paul said, I will be enlarged by you. I will be lifted up instead of condemned by you when your faith increases. You'll stop gossiping about the preacher when you get strong in the truth. Now I'm talking about this. We've been talking about unbelief. We talked about these people here we've been talking about the people in Israel. Been talking about how that God told Israel when they were in the wilderness. I'll find here in a second. When they were in the wilderness, he was saying that the people that he told Israel, he got them over to, hold on, I'll get there in a minute. One of these days I'll get something I can speak it and it'll take me to where I want to go. Now, when they left Egypt, we've been talking about unbelief in Hebrews 3 and 4. Hebrews is a book written to believers, not to Jews, not to Jewish believers only, but all believers. This book is written to Jews of the heart, and that's Gentiles that have been made Jews of the heart. And we've been circumcised of the heart, and a Jew is not outwardly, but of the heart. That's what the Bible says. Now, when Israel came down, we concluded in our previous lessons, when they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea here. They came down to Sinai in the southern Sinai Peninsula, made their way up to Kadesh Barnea. And because they wouldn't go in and attack the land of Anak, the Anakims, and they were gigantic men, probably Goliath's ancestors. He was somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 feet, 6 inches tall. Huge man. And you wouldn't think that anybody would want to go out there and fight him. David went out to fight him, not because he thought he could out-wrestle him, but because he had a sling that he was an expert with. And a sling was a very dangerous weapon. In fact, Alexander the Great had an entire company of men with slings. He had a move that he would do on the enemy. He would bring an army out in front of him. Then before he got to the enemy, he would take his army and go sideways to the side, and behind all of these men was an entire company of men with slings, and they could hit a target, hit a hair's breadth. It was like having a rifle with a great big ball in it. And they could hit dead center from long distances, and that's how he would win over a lot of his armies and with some of his other tactics as well. So we were talking about how when they came up here to Kadesh Barnea, that the Bible says they had no faith. They had apistis, A-P-I-S-T-I-S. There's another word that is a synonym for that. You'll find this synonym, you find this word in, you find apistis in Hebrews 3. You find the word A-P-E-I-T-H-O-S, apithos, which means no persuasion. It comes from pithos, P-E-I-T-H-O, or pitha, and the alpha privative. It means, pitho means to persuade. That's the word that Paul used when he said, do I persuade men or God? If I persuade men, I'm not the servant of Christ. That's in Galatians, the 1st chapter. Apithos means no persuasion. No. He said, I have not persuaded. No persuasion. In fact, let's go back and look at these words. I need to show you these words in Hebrews, the 3rd chapter. Hebrews 3. Hebrews 3. And if you go to Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, we'll look at verse 12. Paul is talking about when they were in the wilderness. Hebrews 3 is talking about when Israel had left Egypt and they were in this wilderness. And they come up here to Kadesh Barnea. Chapter 3 and 4 is about they were afraid to go into Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod, which are cities of the Philistines. But that came later because this was prior to the Philistines, when that was the land of Anak, and that's on the southwestern border of Israel. It's called the Gaza Strip today. Gaza Strip. That's what it's called today. And this is Israel. And this is on the southwest corner. Israel is divided into two sections. You got the Sea of Galilee up here, and then you Jordan River running down into the Dead Sea in the south. Now, I want us to look at this. He's talking about in this chapter, he's talking about they had no faith. Look here in Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, and I'll just review a little bit of this to get on with the subject. So this is the no faith. The Bible says they didn't have any faith. Hebrews 3 and verse 12. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief. Pistis. A-P-I-S-T-I-S. Well, I had it written up here. An evil heart of no faith. That's the first form of faith we talked about. No faith. Well, if you have faith, God's got to put it in your heart. What God says, He said, you were up there. I've said this so many times, but there's so much to this story. He said, you spied out the land for 40 days. You came back and said, we can't go into the land. So you were leaders of these tribes that went and spied it out. So everyone 20 years old and upward, I'm going to put you in the wilderness a year for the day you spied it out, and I'm going to put you there for 40 years until I kill off all the unbelievers, all the unbelief, all the apistos. And I keep saying this. When you get to the book of Deuteronomy, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they were in the wilderness in Exodus, the 12th chapter, all the way through the book of Numbers. They were in the wilderness here. And God was killing off, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, He's killing off everyone from 20 years old and upward for 40 years. When you get to Deuteronomy, everyone in the wilderness is a believer. So when you get to Deuteronomy, the 30th chapter, and he says to Israel, choose life, he's not talking about choose whether you want to be saved or not. He's saying select to live for God. Choose is the word bakar. Bakar means to select. He's simply saying the same thing that I say from the pulpit. As a believer, live for Christ. Don't live for yourself. Live for the Lord. That's the only answer, the way through this. So Deuteronomy is never talking to, it is not talking to unbelievers. It's talking to believers. Even when you get into Joshua, before they get to the promise, Joshua is leading believing Israel to conquer the land of Jordan. They couldn't have conquered if Joshua hadn't been a believer and his followers hadn't been believers. That goes back to Deuteronomy, the 28th chapter. if you're obedient to my laws and my commandments and my statutes, you'll go against your enemy one way and they'll flee 7 ways. So when Joshua went to Ai, in the book of Joshua, Ai, that's a city. He went to Gilgal. He went to Jericho. He had no problem beating those people because
Bowie, thanks for the
he
like.
was
Have a very
righteous.
good
The
day.
people that were following him was
I'm
righteous.
trying to stay on
It's
my
not until they
high
get into
gears.
the land
Just got
of
my new
Israel
joystick, so I'm
in Judges,
having
the
fun
second
today.
chapter, that a new nation rises up that did not know God.
Except next time
And
it will be
God
shorter
allows
drives.
them to be conquered by the enemy, by the Midianites there in the 3rd chapter. That's because Joshua died. New leaders rose up that didn't know God. And they kept going after Baal in the grove. All right. Now, where am I? Now let's go back over here. I want us to go over here to, we're talking about unbelief. Look here in Hebrews, the 3rd chapter, verse 12. Take heed, brethren, he's talking about hardening not their hearts as in the provocation in the wilderness. Provocation equals, take heed, brethren, lest there be in you an evil heart of unbelief, just like they were in the wilderness. Unbelief equals provoking God. Unbelief equals provoking God. We've already said, I'll say it again because I love the verse, in Romans 4, 18 and 19. Well, 17 says, God called things that be not as though they were. God quickens the dead, quickens, Z-O-O-P-O-I-E-O, means to make, zoo, alive. The zoo you see living animals. So make alive. God makes alive in verse 17. And Abraham considered not his own body now dead. He was too old to have children in that 18th verse. Neither the deadness of Sarah's womb had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. She didn't ovulate anymore. She couldn't have children, but she did. Abraham didn't have no sperm, no seed, but he did. Because God said so. He made alive the loins of Abraham. And Abraham considered not his own body now dead, neither the deadness of Sarah's womb. Verse 19 says, Abraham staggered not. Staggered not at the promise of God through, this would be staggering through unbelief. So whatever stagger is, that is unbelief. That is apistos. And we've looked the word stagger, and it is the word diakrino. And it means to discriminate. It means you do the deciding what is good and what is bad. That's like people that discriminate against race. They say, well, the black race is bad, the white race is good, or the white race is bad, the black race is good. There's no discrimination other than when God discriminates. God can discriminate, we cannot. God has a race. And the Bible says we are God's race, the Jews of the heart. It has nothing to do with color. Nothing. It has to do with whether God writes upon fleshy tables of your heart or not. It's up to God. He can discriminate. We cannot. So, Abraham staggered not. Here's what you do when you discriminate. Diakrino is the word stagger. It means to discriminate. And it comes from the word dia. Dia means the channel or the method. channel or method. And kreno means to judge, decide, guilty or innocent, guilty
Use.
or innocent. So when you discriminate, you decide who's guilty or innocent, and you can't do that. You can't do that with black or white or red or yellow or anything else. If you are innocent, God has to declare that. The word justify, dikayako, D-I-K.
Oh, thanks for following our Amrut. Sorry, your name. Amrut. Thanks. Have a very good day.
Conformed to the image of his Son, and whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified. It means to render innocent. And that word justify is an aorist indicative verb. That's a past tense, A-O-R-I-S-T. That's a past tense verb, aorist indicative. And that means before the foundation of the world, Jesus justified his family and says, this one's mine, this one's mine. And they're going to be all colors, black and white, red and yellow and brown. But it won't be everybody.
На камеру идешь. Поставь сюда. Ну я не могу сейчас, ты зря делаешь это.
Now I'm talking about this stagger is diakrino. So anytime you find the word diakrino or doubt, usually the word doubt. If a man doubts not in his heart, diakrino, he doesn't become the method of judging. That's what it means. You can't make it mean something else. It's the same thing James, the first chapter, said when it says, if a man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God how he can get through the fire and the trial, and let him not waver. Waver is the word diakrino. Don't you do the judging one day. Our judging depends completely on God's will. We say, thy will is being done, Lord, and I bow to it. That's correct judgment. We're to judge righteous judgment. That's God's judgment. So he says in verse 11, in verse 12, take heed, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief, just like they were when they hardened their hearts, from verse 8 in the wilderness, in departing from the holy God. So what they were involved in, they were departing from God. Then you go over to verse 19. So we see that they could not enter into, it could not enter into what? He keeps talking about rest. The verse 18 talks about entering into God's rest. He's talking about entering into Canaan. These people, 40 years old and upward, they could not enter into God's katapasis. And God compares this settling down. This means to pause down, to settle down. When they settle down, God is comparing getting into the promised land. They're down here in the desert, and he's talking about these people 20 years old and up that murmured against God because they couldn't go into the land of Anak. They're not going to enter into the promised land. And God knows how to pick them all out and make sure they die before they get to the promised land. There's the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River running down there. So he knows how to kill off everybody that doesn't believe him. I'm wanting to really get this over to you because it takes a lot to see it. So he says in that 19th verse of the 3rd chapter, so we see that they could not enter into the Sabbath. You say, you keep calling the katapasis the Sabbath. That's what they didn't do on the Sabbath. They didn't do anything. They rested in their house. They didn't go anywhere. They had to stay in their place according to the 16th chapter of Exodus. So they couldn't enter into the rest because of unbelief. Let me give you a word over here in Deuteronomy 32. This is a reference to Deuteronomy 32 is a reference. This is Moses referencing Numbers 14. When they murmured against God and said, we can't go beat those giants. And this is how, when we come across difficulty in our life, predestination is the Sabbath. We conform to the likeness of Christ, to his image, icon. Jesus rested in everything that was done because it was all the will of his Father. When the Pharisees said, why don't you talk to us? Don't you know we've got power to release you? Pilate said the same thing, and he said, you don't have any power except to be given you of my Father, which is in heaven. He rested in everything they were doing. He was dying for his wife, the church. Why wouldn't he rest in it? If you can learn to really believe predestination, that God works all things after his counsel of his own will, including all the evil. He works everything. Now, go over here to Deuteronomy 32. Deuteronomy 32. And Moses is recounting what happened in Numbers 14 when the people murmured against God. This is this whole chapter. This whole chapter. Gosh, where can I start here? Let me read some of this. I'll start here in about verse 8. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. And the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance. Lot means measured out. And Jacob is Israel. Israel is God's inheritance. He found him in the desert land and in the waste, howling wilderness. He led him about. This is God leading Israel about. Instructed him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. The Bible says repeatedly that Israel is the apple of the eye. The apple is the pupil. That's what God sees. As an eagle stirreth up her nest, fluttereth over her young, spreadeth abroad her wings, taketh them and beareth them up on her wings. I've read this out of the customs and the culture of the Jews. The eagle would push one of the baby eaglets. An eaglet was a baby eagle, E-G-L-E-T. Hold on here. Get my pen. I dropped it. An eaglet, E-G-L-E-T, was a baby eagle. She would, thinking when she thought it was ready for the baby eagle to learn, she pushed it off the nest. And when it would flap and it couldn't fly, she would swoop down under it and give it some of the lift with the big wings that she had and flap, and the baby eaglet would fly and get on up using its mother's power and lift, and it would get back up to the nest. This is a wonderful picture of how we'll mount up with wings as eagles if we trust in the Lord. He will mount up with wings as eagles. It will run and not be weary, will not run and not faint. And then he says, so the Lord alone did lead Israel, and there was no strange God with him. He made him to ride on the high places of the earth. This is talking about God leading Israel, and he'll make us do the same thing. That he might eat the increase of the fields, and make him to suck honey out of the rock and oil out of the plenty rock. They had lots of honey, milk and honey in Israel. That was the land flowing with milk and honey. That means, Mr. Edersheim tells us in the Sketches of the Jewish Social Life, he says that means that milk and honey means that the cow's udders will be dripping with milk, and that'll be because the bees are buzzing all of this around all of these rocks, and they have these honey stashes up on these rocks, and the Jews could go out there and just sweep their hand across some rock and sweep honey that the bees were making. Butter and of kine and milk of sheep, it's talking about the richness of the land. With fat of lambs and rams of the breeds of Bashan, and goats with the fat of kidneys of wheat, and thou didst drink the pure blood of the grape. That's what Israel drank. There wasn't many good wells in that land, but those deep wells had pure water. But if they couldn't get to them, they drank the pure blood of the grape. They did not drink a drunken elixir. They did not. If it was drunken, it was against God's rules. And don't take me to Noah. Noah shouldn't have been drunk. People say Noah got drunk. Well, doesn't mean, the Bible doesn't say Noah got drunk, go down and do likewise. Doesn't say that. The righteous people in the Bible made a lot of mistakes and did a lot of sin. But Jeshurun, which is another name for Israel, waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxed and fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fullness, with fatness. Then he forsook God, which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They lightly esteemed the rock. That had to do with Moses striking the rock rather than speaking to it. And that's where Moses made the mistake in the wilderness. That's why God didn't let him go over to Canaan. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods. Well, did Israel do that in the wilderness? Yes. They made a golden calf in the 32nd chapter of Exodus. How can God lead you out, and then you start complaining to get Moses and Moses and Aaron, and say, well, he brought us out here to die. He didn't bring you out there to die. Sometimes you think in life he brought you to this point to die. He didn't do that. They provoked God to anger, and they sacrificed unto devils, not to God. The word is shed. It has to do with the same thing, daimonion, in the New Testament. That's our word demon, and that's the word self. They called all their gods by the title of daimonion. To new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. If the rock that begat the capital R, that's Christ with him in the wilderness. If the rock that begat thee, thou art unmindful, has forgotten God that formed thee, Israel. And when the Lord saw it, he abhorred them because of the provoking of his sons. They said, we can't go in and conquer those giants. And every time they turned around, they were provoking God. Every time they turned around. In fact, they were provoking him in Numbers 14, 11 and 23, Numbers 16, 30, Deuteronomy 9 and 7, Deuteronomy 31 and 20, Ezra 5 and 12, Psalms 78 and 40 reminds them of that, what they did in the wilderness. Psalm 78:66, Psalms 106:7, Isaiah 3:8, Ezekiel 8:3, Hebrews 3:16, what we've been reading from. They provoked God, and that was unbelief. What he says in this next verse, and they said, I will hide my face, or God said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end shall be, for they are very froward, tapuka, twist. They twist my words. They're a froward generation, children in whom is no faith. Apistos. But the Old Testament puts it, no faith. And you got, let me go over here. It mentioned this over here. Let me read a couple more verses. They have moved me to jealousy. This is God speaking. Israel has done this. We're in Deuteronomy. He's remembering their sin. And he's warning the current generation, don't do what they did. If you do, I'll bring the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and the beast. They have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities. Was Israel doing that in the wilderness? They were constantly provoking God through unbelief. Faith is believing God. Faith, I keep saying this, faith is death to self. That's what faith is. Faith believes God and quits believing self. Believing self is judging, is diakrino. You do the judging. That's what faith is not, diakrino. It's not you become the channel of judging. Faith is dying to the flesh, saying, God, I'm going to believe you, and I believe you'll take care of all my enemies. If we can come to, there's no doctrine in the Bible stronger than predestination. Whom he didn't foreknow, the people he foreknew. Not what he foreknew, but whom. Masculine and gender singular. Whose. He did foreknow. Prognosko. The family he foreknew, he's predestined us, predetermined us for the boundary of God, or the boundary of life. Prohorizo, pro-horizon. He's pre-horizoned us so that we will be conformed to Christ's likeness. I'm going to try to get into Christ's likeness one of these weeks so that we can understand he was gentle and kind and tender-hearted and merciful and meek. And we've got to become all of these things to be like Jesus. We have to become like him because he's predestined us to be like him. Let me read a little more of this. They provoked me with that which was not called God. They put a capital G in the English Bible. It's not a capital G because it's that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities, and I will move them to jealousy and with those which are not a people, and I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. For a fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn unto the lowest hell. He's talking about his anger is toward Israel that have provoked him with unbelief, with no faith. And shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains. Mountains were capital cities. I'm going to burn the mountains of this world, God says. I will heap mischiefs upon them. This is God talking. And I will spin mine arrows upon them. They shall be burnt with hunger and devoured with burning heat. God's talking to Israel who has provoked him. And with bitter destruction I will also send the teeth of beast upon them. Teeth of beast, what's he talking about? Babylon, Babylonian lion, Persian bear, Grecian leopard, and the beast with iron teeth. Wrong. I will send the teeth of beasts upon them, and with poison of serpents. Serpents, every time you find serpent or asp, it's usually talking about false teachers. Of the dust, the sword without and terror within shall destroy both young man and the virgin and the suckling and the man of gray hairs. I will not pity Israel. He said that over and over again. When he sent Nebuchadnezzar in, he said, I didn't spare anybody. I ripped the babies out of the bellies of the pregnant women. I killed the old man. You had no pity for me. I'll have none for you, Israel. I said I would scatter them into corners. Scattered by the bees. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. I would make the remembrance of them to cease from among men. When they were scattered, Israel wasn't talked about. They were just over there in captivity. Were it not that I feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversaries should behave themselves strangely, and lest they should say, our hand is high, and the Lord hath not done all of this. He doesn't want the enemy saying, we have a high hand, and we've whipped Israel. God says, I don't want them saying this. Now, I want us to go back to Numbers, the 20th chapter. This is where I've got so many places to go with this. This is where Moses murmurs against God. Numbers 20, Moses murmurs against God. He provokes God with his unbelief. It doesn't make him an unbeliever. Moses has to be corrected by God. Numbers 20. Moses does something that's completely outrageous. And it cost him the promised land. He's not going to be able to go into the promised land because of what he does. And in this 20th chapter of Numbers, 2 people died because of the wickedness of their heart. They're believers. This shows you just how much God can do to believing men. It's just like Manasseh in that 20th chapter, 2 Kings, when Manasseh caused his son to pass through the fire to Moloch.
Hello, I'm sorry I cannot read your name. It's Shayadi. Sorry, I butchered this one.
And he was the son of
Hello, you
the
to you too.
righteous kings who ever lived, Hezekiah. And boy, when I first read about Manasseh, not to be confused with the second-born son of Jacob.
How are you doing
He
today?
had Joseph. Not to be confused with that Manasseh. Manasseh was a common name like John or Jim in that day and time. There were many men named Manasseh. And I thought, boy, this guy deserves to go to hell. And then he gets carried away, and you don't read his final days until you get over to the book of Chronicles. When you get to Chronicles, or you get to Jeremiah, the last chapter, he converts, he repents, and Manasseh repents and cries out to God. But it just shows you how evil righteous men can do. In this 20th chapter, this is a very, very interesting chapter. Remember in Numbers 13 and 14, that's where the people provoke God by saying we can't go into the land and conquer those giants. I keep saying it's amazing to me, just months before, God had conquered the largest army in the world, Pharaoh's army, and everybody was terrified of them. And they say, we can't whip these giants. God says, I don't intend for you to whip them. I whip them. He always had his miracles. So in this book of Numbers, in the this is where they provoke God. And they get to Kadesh Barnea right after they leave Mount Sinai in Numbers, the 10th chapter. So they're leaving Sinai, they get to Kadesh Barnea in that 12th and 13th chapter, and when you get to the 20th chapter, they're still at Kadesh Barnea. They haven't left there yet. And they're in the 20th chapter, they're still at Kadesh Barnea, where they murmured against God. Kadesh Barnea. And there's some interesting things that happen in this 20th chapter. Miriam, the older sister of Moses, dies. Miriam dies. And Aaron, Moses' older brother, dies. Aaron dies. And Moses rebels against God and does something that God does not instruct him to do. He strikes. The people are murmuring. People are always griping and complaining, yet they wouldn't stop. The people of Israel were murmuring. This is a lot like we are. That wilderness, I keep saying it, that was a picture as our life. You can put it this way. If this is a wilderness, this is our life. And we have all the same wrestling matches they had. We've got this Pharaoh that we think we can't conquer, and then we got these giants in the land of Anak we think we can't conquer, and we start provoking God with unbelief. So we just back off and quit. Well, that's what they were doing. They were griping because they had no water. You know how many times they did that? Over and over and over again. Always griping and complaining. How much time do I have, Mike? All right. I want us to read this chapter because Moses does something that's just unheard of. All right, let's read here. Then came the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, unto the desert of Zin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh. They're still at Kadesh Barnea. And Miriam died there. I told you this a couple of weeks ago. The reason she died, she had murmured against Moses over here in the 12th chapter of Numbers, because he had married an Ethiopian woman, and God got in a rage at her. She said, well, you only talk to Moses, and there's me and Aaron, and she was the instigator in this. We know that by what God did to Miriam. And she murmured against Moses, and he married an Ethiopian. He married a black woman. And God said, he is my man, and you have murmured against him, and I will kill you. And he told Moses, you tell Aaron and Miriam, Aaron was the instigator here, you tell them to come to the door of the temple. I want to talk to them. Whoa. You want God to send that to you for murmuring against his will? If I'm the preacher and you murmur against me, you'll have to pay to God for that. If I am the preacher. And I believe I am. I believe God put me here from eternity to tell people truth. I have so many people murmuring against me. If I'm the man of God, you better shut your mouth. I won't do anything to you. God will. The preachers always getting talked about, but they should if they're preaching free will and Christmas. Now, Miriam, God strikes her with leprosy when she comes to the door of the temple. And Moses cries out, "Oh God, please remove that from her." So I believe God killed her here for her sin, her lack of belief that God had picked Moses and not her and not Aaron. Moses couldn't talk. When God came to Moses in that 3rd chapter up to the 6th chapter of Exodus, Moses said, I'm a man of a thick lip, Lord. I can't give speeches. I can't talk. God says, Aaron, your older brother, will be your prophet. A prophet is one who speaks for another. He will speak for you. It was Aaron that said the things to Pharaoh. It wasn't Moses. Moses was God's leader. Now let's keep reading. There was no water for the congregation. Here we go again. It's happened many times before. And for they gathered themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. Your fault, you brought us out here to die, didn't you? Oh, they'd done that before. They said that in the 14th chapter. Let's kill Moses and Aaron. Get us a leader to take us back to Egypt. That's kind of like, let's get me a leader to take me back to sin. And the people chod Rube with Moses. Rube means to fight. And spake, saying, Would God that we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have ye brought up the congregation of the Lord into the wilderness, that we and our cattle should die?
Hi, Tahir. How are you?
Faith in God, did they?
I'm doing a little drive here.
And wherefore have you made us to come up out of Egypt?
It won't be
to
long.
bring us unto this evil place of Kadesh Barnea. It is no place of seed or of figs. There's no trees here. There's nothing here that we want. We're in a desert.
How are you, Tahir?
Or vines, or pomegranates, neither is any water to drink. Nothing to eat here, no water. What do you want from us, Moses? So I have people saying, what do you want from me in this desert of life? And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly into the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and they fell upon their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod, gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak unto the rock before their eyes. He said, speak to the rock, talk to it, that's all. It reminds us of Exodus 17. This is right after they got into the wilderness, Exodus 17. And here's what happened over here, Exodus 17 in verse 5. Well, let's start reading in verse 3. And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses because they were thirsty in the desert. It's like God can supply. I think we've said that in our lives. Against Moses, and said, Wherefore is this that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us? They said that when they left Egypt in the 12th chapter, just a few chapters before. To kill us and our children, our cattle, and thirst. And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. They want to kill me. Sometimes people want to kill the preacher because he's leading them.
Hey, hi, dude.
Life.
Dinesh Kumar, how are you?
And the Lord
Just
said
having
to
fun
Moses,
driving
Go
manual now.
on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, when it opened up to let him through. Taking thine hand and go, and behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and Christ is the rock in the wilderness. He's the figure.
Warthouse, thanks for following. Have a very good day.
Smite the rock. That's not what he said in verse chapter 20.
Thanks for the like.
There in verse 8.
Just
Smite
learning
the rock,
to drive
and
that
there shall
18
come
speed
water out of
manual.
it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Maasah and Meribah because of the chiding of the children of Israel. They were always arguing with Moses. Even after in the 16th chapter of Exodus, God supplied them with manna. And later on in that 14th chapter of Numbers, he supplied them with doves in the morning and manna in the evening. And because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Now, he smote the rock there, and water came forth. Over here in Numbers, the 20th chapter, he says, speak to the rock. That's all I want you to do. If you trust God,